Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the webinar on global trends and climate legislation, lessons learned for COP26. My name is Alina Verchenkova, and I'm a distinguished policy fellow and lead for governance and legislation at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion today, held in collaboration with Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance at the University of Strathclyde Law School in Glasgow and the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. Today's event is part of a two-day series of discussions on the rule of law and in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And the second part will be tomorrow, focusing specifically on the role of climate litigation. For those of you who are using Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is LCAW 2021, London Climate Action Week 2021. This event is being recorded and subject to no technical difficulties, will be also available as podcast after all. As usual, you have an opportunity to ask questions. Please use Q&A feature in Zoom to post your questions to the speakers. If you like a particular question that someone else has posed, please vote on it and we will prioritize questions which have received more votes. And please also let us know your name and affiliation, as we would like to particularly hear from students, alumni, and also young researchers from around the world. We have a really exciting panel today. So in a minute, I will provide you some highlights on the global trends in climate legislation. And then we will have a discussion with distinguished experts, Amy Steele, who is legal officer of the UNFCCC Secretariat, Claire Macmillen, a deputy director on climate change at BASE Legal Advisors, Honorable Waven, who is a member of the National Assembly of Seychelles and the bureau member of Inter-Parliamentary Union, Michel Gerrard, who is director of Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and Michel Blas, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. I will introduce each speaker in more detail before they take the floor. But at the moment, I would like to share with you some highlights on climate change legislation. So why do we talk about climate legislation in the context of COP26? Some of you might wonder, climate legislation is a domestic issue. Why is it important for climate negotiations? Well, the way the Paris Agreement is structured, the effectiveness of international efforts to address climate change will be only as good as the national implementation of targets that are being committed under the Paris Agreement. So over the past 20 years, we have seen a growth in climate laws and policies at the national level. At the time the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, there were about 100 such policies and laws around the world. And this map shows you the countries where we could find climate-related laws and policies for that year. However, if we go to today's time in 2021, we count with 2,250 such laws and policies around the world. And about 38% of those are legislative instruments adopted by parliaments and national assemblies. Over time, there has been a growth in legislative activity, in particular after the Copenhagen summit in 2009. And you can see that over time, the legislation has been increasingly adopted, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. So this table here shows you some examples. So the first comprehensive national climate change legislation was adopted in the UK, the UK Climate Change Act. And we're very fortunate to have Claire today, who will share with us some insights on how the implementation of this legislation has evolved over time in the UK. But there are also very important legislative instruments in emerging economies, such as Mexico's General Law on Climate Change of 2012, which was amended in 2018 to bring it into consistency with the nationally determined contribution of Mexico under the Paris Agreement. There is a Kenya Climate Change Act of 2016, which was the first comprehensive climate law adopted in Africa, a number of laws in Latin America. But very excitingly, this year, we have seen really crucial developments in the area of climate legislation. The European Union has adopted the first regional level legislation that sets objectives for net zero emission reductions. This is a very recent development, and we're very excited to hear from Michel Blas in just a few minutes on how that was made possible and what it means for the European transition. Also, really importantly, looking towards COP26, the return of the United States to the international climate change negotiations and raising ambition of the United States under the NDC, including objectives of transition towards net zero, poses a very important impulse to climate negotiations, but also a challenge. So we're looking forward to hear from Michael, Gerrard on how US might be able to get to that target. However, as impacts of climate change are exacerbating, it is very important also to think about how climate legislation can help vulnerable countries such as Seychelles, for example, to address adaptation and resilience to the impacts of climate change. So Honorable William will talk about that later on today. And finally, what is the role of international cooperation and international instruments and international negotiations in helping countries advance their domestic agenda on climate change? And we're looking forward to hearing from Amy in a minute on what are the expectations from climate change negotiations. So with that, without further ado, I will move to the panel discussion. Again, I'm reminding you, please pose your questions to the chat. And our first speaker is Amy Merrill. She is a senior lawyer at the UNFCCC Secretariat and advises on transparency mechanisms and compliance, and also on general counsel matters at the Secretariat. Amy leads the Secretariat's support to negotiations on Article 6 on carbon markets of the Paris Agreement, and in 2015 supported negotiations on mitigation and the issues that later became Articles 4, 5, and 6 of the Paris Agreement. Amy is also legal advisor to the CDM Executive Board and the Secretary to the Paris Implementation and Compliance Committee. Before joining the Secretariat, Amy was the senior associate of the climate change and climate finance practice at the Linklaters LLP in London, and advised international banks and multilateral corporations on climate finance and carbon finance legal structures. So Amy, welcome. What are the key expectations for the COP26, and how do you see the role of national implementation and climate legislation in ensuring the success of the Paris Agreement? And given your deep expertise and transparency, I was also wondering if you can perhaps tell us a little bit about the linkages between the transparency framework and basically what issues should countries consider when they develop their climate laws, given the transparency framework at the international level. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for having the UNFCCC here today. I suspect we are the lightest member of the panel, and it's really nice to join you as you go into much more depth of things about which you all know far more. I'm really here to, what are the key expectations from COP26? I'm sure that Claire will also be able to address that. From the side of the package of what we're hoping to see, we've got the finance package, the adaptation package, mitigation, transparency, and mechanisms. And together we're hoping that we'll see a full delivery across the COP of outcomes on those 5 areas. In finance, we need to see predictability, clarity, and transparency around the finance available for engaging in climate change action, mobilization and provision of climate finance, and particularly on the adaptation side. And then, we'll be looking at the post-2020 arrangements for finance and how to deal with the 100 billion. I think also in the adaptation package, we'll be looking to see how countries are going to deal with their NAPs and what will be the outcomes on loss and damage, and what the conversation will be around the global goal on adaptation. In the mitigation piece of what we're looking for at COP26, obviously we've had updated NDCs, some of them delayed due to the COVID pandemic. So we'll be looking at what comes out of the updated synthesis report provided by the Secretariat and long-term low emission development strategies. Also in the mitigation space, we'd expect the continuing amount of non-state actor action to build into that discussion in the COP. In transparency, we're in a rather more of a technical phase. Many of you will know that the whole system for understanding what national jurisdictions are doing in order to implement their NDCs is in part delivered through the transparency regime. And a lot of the framework for that was adopted in Katowice in 2018, but the actual method for giving that information is quite technical. It comes in tables, and it's still in progress, and we're expecting to see delivery of that at the COP. So the method for actually communicating what has happened at the national level has to come into the UNFCCC forum so that everybody has agreed the way they will say what they've done. And then the last piece of the package is the piece that I have the pleasure or the burden of leading from the Secretariat side, which is around cooperation towards NDCs, and it's called Article 6. And it's this voluntary instruments that enable greater action towards NDCs in different forms. And long overdue, this piece of the Paris Agreement architecture and infrastructure is supposed to come home, and decisions will be adopted. So I think, that's the package. It's a really big COP, and I'm sure Claire will talk more about that. And, national implementation and climate change legislation is everything to the Paris Agreement. Fundamentally, an NDC is a contribution from a country, and whatever that contribution contains, the idea is that it's implemented through policies, measures, legislation within that country. And so the success, I think you said it at the start, Alina, the success of the Paris Agreement fundamentally depends on the rate of change of policies towards the 1.5, towards net zero, towards sustainable development goals, the holistic piece, and that is there's no getting around it. You can have a beautiful Paris Agreement, but without implementation, it's still just a piece of paper. And so I think, when you look at where that would intersect in this COP, the transparency framework is about how you provide information, the frequency with which you provide information, and the nature of what information you provide, and how quantitative or qualitative it is, how much finance you need, how much finance you're giving, depending on where you are in the world as a country, and how much mitigation you have achieved or you are intending to achieve over the lifetime of your nationally determined contribution. And so when a country has put forward their NDC and hasn't yet got the system to implement that, there you start to see where the transparency framework can help bring that in, help show the way, but also can help identify where things are not on track for delivery. And I think that one of the things we will see in this first NDC cycle is that not every country will have worked out exactly how to deliver the things that they hope to deliver. And there'll be a process of going through the stock take, the global stock take, and also through the Paris Implementation and Compliance Committee, which is a facilitative committee, to try to help countries understand where capacity building particularly is needed, where more knowledge sharing for implementation of legislation could be useful. And I think from this first NDC cycle, we'll really start to be able to match up vision against reality. And I think that that's why the discussion around climate change legislation, climate change litigation becomes so important, because it's, you know, it's really where the rubber hits the road. If the frameworks can all be brilliant, but unless and until we're actually enabling countries to deliver implementation and enforcement, it's still very aspirational. So perhaps that's useful, and I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Alina.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for highlighting the importance of backing up pledges with implementation and enabling countries to actually achieve their pledges. I'm sure we're going to come back to this issue in the discussion, but for now I'm going to go to Claire Macmillan, who is a Joint Deputy Director for the Climate Change and Clean Energy Legal Team at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the United Kingdom Government. Claire's team is responsible for international and domestic climate change law, delivery of COP26 and the UK's Clean Energy Domestic Programme, as well as the international climate finance. She's a solicitor by trade and has held a variety of posts in the government legal department, including at the Cabinet Office, the Department for Energy and Climate Change, and the Department for Transport. She has a long-standing interest in international law and practice and the intersection of international legal frameworks with domestic regulatory regimes, which is a really perfect background to go to the next set of questions. So Claire, based on the UK's experience really as a pioneer and champion in terms of adopting, as I mentioned, the first comprehensive national framework climate change law, from your perspective, how can climate change legislation help raise ambition at the national level and implement and ratchet ambition under the Paris Agreement over time, particularly looking towards COP26 as the ambition COP, as we expected? And what would you say have been the experience of the UK in this respect and the key learnings for other countries on the key elements of a climate law that enable implementation of the Paris Agreement and greater ambition over time? Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Alina, and thank you so many to fellow esteemed panel members. I feel somewhat of a fraud compared to people with such long and illustrious backgrounds in climate change. I'm delighted to be here. Our team is responsible for delivering not only COP26, but a lot of the domestic work behind the scenes on our domestic agenda. And my remarks obviously here are our personal capacity, not as a spokeswoman for the UK government, but I'm very happy to answer insofar as I can any questions in the chat. My opening remarks pick up very much on Amy's theme. While COP26 is absolutely critical in terms of delivering and getting that high ambition, what happens once the banners are taken down and everyone departs? How do we translate those kind of high ambitions into things giving us actual legal effect? And as Dr. Alina alluded to, in the United Kingdom, we were one of the pioneer countries, so to speak, I believe, one of the first developed countries to adopt a climate change framework law in 2008. And I was reflecting that actually this means that at the time of COP26, our act will become a teenager. It will be 13 years young. And so I thought I would give some remarks about the key features that we have learned over the time from this how this framework has continued to evolve over those past 13 years. So in terms of highlights, the first thing the UK's Act does is it applies economy-wide. It's comprehensive. There is no particular sector which is singled out, though we have to have regard for the costs and impacts on particular parts of the economy. So this has the effect of making climate change mainstream and not something which is carved out for niche consideration. So that's kind of key element one. The second is that it imposes clear legal responsibility on a state actor. So in that case, that is the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, my main client. And the Secretary of State is subject to a legal duty to ensure that by 2050, UK carbon emissions are 100% below the baseline of 1990. And this shows another feature of the Act, that this was revised down from an 80% reduction to a 100% reduction in 2019, and perhaps we can talk about how that was achieved. But we all know 2050 is a long way off. And so how do we get from where we are, or from where we were in 2008 to 2050? So the third feature of the Act is that it imposes on the Secretary of State a duty to create a series of carbon budgets. These are stepping stones to take us all the way down from where we were in 2008 down to 2050. And these are 5-year periods of time, and it creates a limit, a budget, on the amount of collective emissions that the UK can do. And these are set some 12 years ahead of time. So we have just passed through our domestic parliament carbon budget 6, which is the one setting a 78% reduction for the period 2033 to 2037. And that one state actor, the Secretary of State, is then under a duty to ensure those carbon budgets are not exceeded. So that's key factor 2. The next one is that how do you involve the role of experts and independents in this process? And here, under the UK framework, we have a very prestigious and independent climate change committee, for which we have to have regard to their advice and input when setting these carbon budgets and setting these targets. The Secretary of State must report annually to Parliament, and after setting each budget, has to bring forward plans and proposals and policies to meet current and future budgets. So you have a degree of oversight and transparency involving independent experts and with oversight from Parliament. The final point I would make is one of temporal responsibility. As we say, the Act builds in these check-in points. So there is almost a regular rhythm of setting, assessing, and implementing these carbon budgets. This is statutory, it's set out in law, and it continues regardless of any changes in political makeup over time. And that, of course, is backed up by enforcement, if necessary, by our domestic courts. So that's where we've come from. Where do we go as our Act enters the teenage years? As you will have seen, the UK has set very challenging carbon budgets, and obviously, of course, it's NDC. And as we might be discussing in the session tomorrow, there is obviously an increase in litigation. However, the Act so far has proved quite robust in terms of how it is managed to manage to keep the UK on target. There has not yet been a successful challenge to that. So it's an interesting way of how a framework of over 13 years old has continued to survive quite a varied and changeable political background in the United Kingdom. So that is a gross simplification, and there are people on the line, I'm sure, who could provide far more detail and expertise about how the technicalities of that work. So I'll simply finish my remarks there, if I may, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing others' reflections and others' ways of approaching regulatory regimes as we translate those pledges and those key things we're looking from at COP26 into those concrete deliverable enforcement actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for this really useful insights and for highlighting the importance of climate legislation and protecting against potential political changes. So I hope we can pick up on some of these themes later on in the discussion. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to go to Honourable Waven William, who is a member of the National Assembly of Seychelles and a bureau member of the Inter-Parliamentary Union Standing Committee on Sustainable Development. Representing the district of Grantham for the party in the National Assembly, he is also the chairperson of the International Affairs Committee and serves as a member of the Standing Orders Committee and the Committee on Reforms and Modernizations in Seychelles. Honourable William has also served on the Bureau for the ACP-EU Parliamentary Assembly, was a resident High Commissioner to India and non-resident High Commissioner to several other countries, including Sri Lanka, Australia, Israel, Indonesia, Maldives, and New Zealand. He, under his portfolio were also the dossier for the non-alignment movement and the Indian Ocean rim groupings. So really immense experience. So, Mr. Willem, I'd like to hear your perspective on how can international cooperation between national parliaments, such as the one taking place in the context of Inter-Parliamentary Union, help enable implementation of the Paris Agreement and also help raise ambition at the national level? And how can it particularly help developing countries? And from your own perspective, coming from a highly vulnerable nation to the impacts of climate change, what is the potential for climate laws in enabling climate action in countries like your own? Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would like to start by saying that Inter-Parliamentary Union, as a multilateral parliamentary body, has and can and is playing a critical role in ensuring that member countries' national parliaments exercise their oversight roles much better to ensure that the Paris Agreement is implemented and meets objectives as agreed to their respective national determined contributions and in their respective sustainable national development plan. There is a dire need for more legislations to promote friendly climate change policies. Parliamentarians have a constitutional mandate given by the people to formulate laws, and it gives them a pivotal status to mainstream climate change laws to support sustainable development and the SDG targets. On the other hand, the lack of knowledge on climate change and knowledge of their authority as parliamentarians to take the lead on their oversight and legislating role can have a negative impact on the political will and the influence for more commitments to national climate change activities. It can also lead to very poor and slow accountability oversight processes, which can also contribute to a lethargic mindset for proactiveness. IPU, therefore, is a multilateral parliamentary platform where gaps can be identified and addressed through tailor-made capacity building modules for both parliamentarians and officials of parliamentary institutions. IPU also develops self-assessment handbooks as a toolkit to guide parliamentarians into their oversight roles. Cognizant of our vulnerable status to the impacts of climate change, as a member of parliament and chairperson of the International Affairs Committee, as well as the newly elected IPU member for Sustainable Development Committee, I feel privileged and very engaged to contribute to the global concern and to the implementation of the legal binding commitments of the Paris Agreement. In view that I understand my role and responsibility, which is foremost, I am doing the following. 1, questioning the policymakers on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Number 2, conducting oversight roles on the National Sustainable Development Strategy and Action Plan. Conduct oversight on the budget allocation and spending of the government ministry concerned. Conduct evaluation project site visits to ensure expected results. Approve climate change related laws. Ratify protocols, agreements, conventions, and treaties that support sustainable development and climate change. Together with other members, participate and contribute ideas and possible solutions, as well as advance our country's position as a small, vulnerable island state to climate change in sub-regional, regional, and multilateral parliamentary forums, such as in CPA, ACP-EU, SADC, AU, and IPU. Initiate the creation or form part of SEEDS groupings wherever possible to have a common SEEDS voice and position on climate change. IPU General Assembly has over the passing years adopted emergency resolutions, among others, targeting climate change, such as parliamentary strategies to strengthen peace and security against threats and conflicts resulting from climate-related disasters and their consequences, urging countries to undertake stronger measures and actions against climate change. In line with the Paris Agreement, the declaration of the virtual segment of the 5th World Conference of Speakers in August 2020, affirming parliamentarians' commitment to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Emergency items resolution adopted at the 139th IPU General Assembly in Geneva, Switzerland, entitled Climate Change, let us not cross the line. Urging member countries to commit to reducing greenhouse gases pre-industrial level, asking for the fast tracking of Climate Action Fund to address global gaps among nations to deliver on their targets. The 140th IPU GPA in Doha, Qatar also saw the adoption of another emergency item resolution linked to climate change to rally support in addressing the damages caused by enhanced natural disasters through climate change. In all, IPU has given special attention to climate change legislation, seen as a critical tool to parliamentarians' oversight role to ensure delivery of targets by policymakers. IPU recognizes the need for capacity buildings on legislation for parliamentarians, and of which, as I mentioned before, tailor-made programs are designed for different parliamentarian institutions. IPU is grateful to the United Nations Environment Programs and London School of Economics. IPU notes that countries are doing their best to legislate on climate change, and some with the ability more than others. The Seychelles and the IPU firmly believe that the top priority focus on COP26 should be on delivering of success and to secure commitment on more ambitious intended national determined contribution globally. Achieved if the two global projects mentioned above, such as global trade and the SDGs, I believe we can be successful. Madam Moderator, for example, Seychelles, our vulnerability aspects of Seychelles to climate change are critical infrastructures, tourism sector, food security, coastal and maritime resources, water and energy security, health sector, waste disposal, disaster preparedness. Moving forward, I feel that the political will is there, but the concern remains always with the pace of transition from old culture of energy usage to green energy. The inherent differentiation in capacity nature of member countries has to be recognized and accepted. Policy space has to be accorded in the gradual transformation journey so as not to lose stability and resilience to remain economically sustainable long term. The introduction of climate change national laws is worth considering to ensure that set targets, timeline, and institutional mechanisms are put in place to enable oversight, monitoring, auditing, and evaluation. The vulnerability nature of small and developing states has not only to be understood, accepted, and supported as states takes initiatives to adopt its own homegrown solutions to adaptation, mitigation, as we are not the major pollutants. If climate change legislation to allow litigation procedures are now a much needed legal tools to stay on course globally and nationally to honor commitment, no more can we afford to procrastinate and push back timeline. Time barred is to be lawfully respected, period. In conclusion, the narrative of access to an affordable technology transfer has to be real and measurable to be taken seriously. As it is said, put action where our mouth is. For us, as seeds, seeing is believing, which will inspire us more to reach the set targets. On behalf of the people and government of Seychelles, I thank all our valuable international partners for standing by us each time we present our case. We would like you to also take note, especially now, do not measure us up as a high middle income country. The pandemic COVID-19 has robbed us of this status rating. Even if you do not accept it, it is so. And we call on your support more so to stay resilient with time to collectively overcome this global pandemic. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable William. Thank you for highlighting the important work the IPU is doing, but also the challenges that highly vulnerable countries face in terms of impacts of climate change and the pandemic at the moment. A very important issue, which I think worthwhile coming back to. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to go to our next speaker, who is Michel Blas. He's a member of European Parliament, where he negotiated for the Greens and EFA group the European climate law and industrial strategy, which is, of course, one of the very exciting developments internationally of the past few months. Michel grew up in Stuttgart and studied international relations and globalization and development in Dresden and London. He worked as a consultant for the United Nations Development Group in the regional parliament of Baden-Württemberg and for Ska Keller in Brussels before he was elected to the European Parliament in 2019. He's a member of the Committee on ITRE and a substitute member for ENVI Committee. He's also coordinator of Climate Core Group within the Greens EFA Group. He became engaged in the Greenpeace Youth Wing early on and then joined the Grüne Jugend in 2008. He's a member of the party board of Bündnis 90 Die Grünen in his home region Baden-Württemberg. So Miguel, I think we're all very, very interested to know how the European climate law has come about, and what would you say are the most important elements of this legislation, but also your assessment of its potential shortcomings in ensuring transition to net zero in Europe. And what were the key challenges in negotiating this legislation, and how did you manage to actually bring so many countries with different national circumstances together and actually agree on that? So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alina, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting and exciting panel. It's true, it's a little bit like Claire has now a teenager and we have a newborn baby. It just came, well, we just have it actually yesterday. The law was then signed by all institutions, so now it's here, and it was always we wanted, or with this climate law, we wanted to actually implement the Paris Agreement on the European level, and the EU as such. I mean, we together as the EU, we give in our NDC. So it's important and it's clear that we as the European Union as such, we will have to have a common climate law where we are identifying and putting into law our climate targets. And I think that the good and positive things are really, we have now the climate neutrality target, a domestic climate neutrality target for the year 2050. On the European level, we have a target of net minus 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction until the year 2030. And so that we changed the calculation here. Before it was always a gross, now it's a net target. So it's in real emission reductions actually 52.8%. The rest is LULUCF accounting. We have a way we come up with the next 2040 target. This will be set in the year 2023, and actually on hopefully interesting process, because there will be a report from the European Commission on the EU's remaining CO2 budget or greenhouse gas budget for the years 2030 to 2050, and taking this into consideration, we will be setting the next 2040 target. So we do not have this kind of slice into years, but we will have like an overall remaining CO2 budget, which I think it will be a very interesting conversation how to establish this CO2 budget altogether. And what I also I'm very happy about, and it was also with the help of Alina that we actually get a scientific, independent scientific body that is advising now the European Commission and the European Parliament, and giving yearly reports on where we are, where we stand, giving recommendations. And their first report, most probably, I mean, they will be independent, but will be actually on the CO2 budget and how this can be computed for the European Union. So this is all in all very good. However, and this is the most important question, when climate scientists from the Climate Action Tracker rate the European target, they actually say it's not in line with the Paris target. It will actually bring us to a global temperature rise between 2 and 3 degrees, and not well below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. So this is really a major shortcoming. So in the end, if you want to really judge it, you would say, well, this the aim and the objective of the law, which was to implement the Paris Agreement, has not, fully being fulfilled, because Paris clearly says below 2 degrees. So I think I need to also voice this criticism, especially coming from a Green Party and also, well, coming from the European Parliament. And this maybe also comes to the key challenges, the European Parliament. So I'm not sure everyone is aware of, legislation or lawmaking on the European level, but it's the European Parliament and the member states having to decide together on the legislation. So the European Parliament comes up, the Commission makes a proposal, the Parliament comes up with their own ideas, and the member states do it. And then the member states and the Parliament, we have to negotiate and come up with a common proposal. The European Parliament's proposal was much more ambitious. Actually, we wanted to have a 60% gross emission reduction till the year 2030. And from the year 2030 on, we wanted to not set new targets, but we wanted to only use the remaining CO2 budget for guiding us how to compute how to program the remaining reduction. We wanted to actually also, for the implementation, end all fossil subsidies, because that would be already a first good step. And we wanted to actually have an entry into the element of individual right to a healthy climate and a healthy environment, by giving individuals the possibility to stand in front of the law, to request the implementation of the national climate plans that member states have to create and submit to the European Union. So we have not, as the European Parliament, we were not able to actually get these additional things into the law, also because the lawmaking in the beginning was that it's the heads of state from the European Union that have to agree in a unanimous manner, agreed on this 55 net target. And thus the Council did not see any possibility to make a compromise here with the European Parliament. So that was maybe a shortcoming from the beginning, because then it was not really a legal process in terms of negotiations, but it was the heads of state who basically just set the goal, and then the Parliament had to follow. However, this will be implemented now, and it will be implemented with this so-called Fit for 55 package that will be presented by the European Commission on the 14th of July. And this will be a package with 12 different laws. One of the main things is, of course, the EU Emission Trading scheme that will be adapted to the new law. So hopefully we will see much less emission certificates on the market and a rising price. We will hopefully see the end of free allocation, and we will see a carbon border mechanism to help us against carbon leakage. And we will have the so-called effort sharing regulation revised. In the effort sharing regulation, member states are bound to increase their climate ambition, so to reduce their emissions. And so therefore it's really implemented. It's not just a legal framework, it is about implementation, and it has to be implemented. And there's more laws that will be there, that will be about the renewable energy targets will be increased, the energy efficiency target will be increased. We will hopefully see new CO2 standards for cars, so that new cars will not be able to emit so much CO2 anymore. So it's really a huge bunch of legislation that we will probably deal with for the next 2 years. And we see also that member states, for instance, Germany, are already adapting their own climate laws and their own climate targets to the new European target, because this is the way it trickles down. So the EU level makes a new target, and then it's member states who have to increase and adapt their own targets. I think what is very interesting also to see is that just as a side note, the German Constitutional Court, I think it's now almost 2 months ago, had a really interesting judgment they basically ruled the old German climate law not compatible with the German constitution because it did not comply with the Paris Agreement goals. And basically, they introduced a very interesting notion, the notion of intertemporal freedom rights. So the idea that if we are not acting now quickly on climate change, this will actually restrict future generations' freedoms, and thus it is a breach of the constitution that guarantees these freedoms also for future generations. So this intertemporal freedom rights, I think, it's a really interesting new development that we have to discuss more about. Yeah, and it seems to me that there is an interesting development happening. Actually, today we have a court ruling in Paris, in France, also saying that that France has to have stricter climate laws. We had a court ruling in the Netherlands before that restricted the state, that also now restricts the company. So I think it's a very interesting development that on the legal side, there's really advancements, and courts are even now putting the Paris Agreement into law. The German Constitutional Court says to keep the Paris Agreement goals of below 2 degrees is a direct, how do you say it? It's something that is directly covered by the German Constitution. So that's, I think, an interesting development. So I hope I gave you a little bit of an overview from the European level to how it trickles then down. But yeah, as I said, the European targets are not yet Paris compatible. So in the implementation, we really try to overfulfill them, because it also says at least net 55%, not at most net 55%.
Thank you, Michael, for this really interesting and useful overview. Really exciting developments in Europe, and interesting also to learn how that translates down to the domestic level. So I'm sure we'll come back to that in a minute. But in the meanwhile, we're going to cross the Atlantic and go to the United States. So our next speaker is Michael Gerrard. He's Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental and energy law, and founded and directs the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He's also a member and former chair of the faculty of Columbia's Earth Institute. And before joining the Columbia faculty in January 2009, he was partner in charge of New York office at the Arnold and Porter law firm, and he's now a senior counsel to the firm. He practices environmental law in New York City full-time from 1979 to 2008, and was a chair of the American Bar Association section on environment, energy, and resources in 2004 and 2005. He chaired the executive committee of the New York City Bar Association and the environmental law section of New York State Bar Association. Michael, we are all very excited to see US return to the Paris Agreement and to announce its updated nationally determined contribution, which is a crucial development for the whole international cooperation on climate change and for the dynamics of COP26. However, I'm wondering, given this new commitment under the nationally determined contribution, what legislative initiatives will be required or are already underway in the US to enable it to meet the new targets? Or will we expect the action to advance mainly via executive route? And also in the US, what could help advance implementation of the Paris Agreement, and what accountability mechanisms and legislative innovations can help ensure that these objectives are met? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alina. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. The United States Congress has adopted about 15 major environmental laws, but it did all of that between 1970 and 1990. Congress has not enacted any major new environmental laws in more than 30 years. The reason is the growing partisan divide. There was always a divide between the Democrats and the Republicans, but it was during that 20-year period between 1970 and 1990 bridgeable. Since then, the partisan divide has grown. It continues to grow. Today's Republican Party is the only major party in the world that, as a matter of doctrine, denies the human role in climate change, rejects the idea of government action to fight climate change, and affirmatively supports fossil fuels. President Obama tried to get a comprehensive climate law in 2009 called the Waxman-Markey bill. It narrowly passed the House of Representatives, but it never got to a vote in the Senate because of our filibuster rule. There are 100 members of the Senate, but under this rule, 60 votes are necessary in order to pass substantive legislation. The filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's a rule of the Senate. The Senate could abolish the rule with a simple majority vote. Today's Senate has 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. The ties are broken by the vice president, the Democrat Kamala Harris. But two of the Democrats in the Senate, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona, refused to vote to break the filibuster. So there's very little prospect of getting any substantive climate legislation through the current Congress. It does seem possible to get enough Republican votes to pass part of the big infrastructure bill that President Biden has proposed. Some of it would go to mass transit and clean energy infrastructure and other items that could be helpful to the climate. What will ultimately go into the infrastructure bill is the subject of intense political bargaining that is taking place in Washington right now. There's also an obscure parliamentary procedure called reconciliation, where a budget bill can pass with a simple majority. There's a lot of talk of using that process to pass a clean energy standard, a requirement that electricity come from clean sources, which of course is an important part of the US NDC. We do not know whether that will go through. The biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is transport, mostly automobiles and trucks. And fortunately, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation already have authority under old clean air and energy legislation to regulate these sources of emissions. The Obama administration adopted strong regulations on transport emissions. The Trump administration weakened them. The Biden administration is putting them back and is greatly strengthening them. And Congress is not needed for that. However, to have a full transition to electric vehicles, we need a big program of electric vehicle charging stations. And President Biden is trying to get that through his infrastructure package. The Biden administration is doing just about everything it possibly can under its current legal authority without Congress. Of course, it's rejoined the Paris Agreement. It is strengthening the motor vehicle standards. It will strengthen the standards on emissions of methane and hydrocarbons and other pollutants. It is strengthening the regulations on securities disclosure. The Biden administration is encouraging the construction of wind and solar farms on federal lands and water, and it's taking many other actions. But Congress is needed for a clean energy standard. Congress would be needed to impose a price on carbon, such as a carbon tax, and President Biden has not indicated whether he would support that. Congress would be needed to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels and to increase the subsidies for renewable energy. We don't yet know whether any of this will go through Congress. So most of the US actions to comply with our NDC will have to be met by executive actions. A big problem is that actions by a president can be undone by the next president. In the US, we've seen a complete shift in federal policy whenever a new president from a different party takes office. That happened in the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush. It happened in the transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. It happened with the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, and it's now happening again with the transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. We don't know who will win the 2024 election, whether Joe Biden or another Democrat will stay in the White House, or whether a Republican will be elected. If a Republican takes over after the 2024 election, the principal hope for stability is that the momentum that is being built up in various industries continues. So the electrification of the motor vehicle industry and the growth of wind and solar are building up their own momentum. And hopefully that will continue even if a Republican takes over, but we can't be certain. Meanwhile, I don't see any prospect for legislative accountability mechanisms to ensure compliance with the US NDC. It's mostly in the hands of the president and his administration. President Biden has brought in a remarkably able group of people around him in the White House and in all of the environmental and energy agencies, and they're doing everything they can. But Congress continues to be a major roadblock. The courts are likely to intervene only if a failure to fulfill the goals in the NDC are a violation of a congressionally enacted statute. And I don't see much prospect for one of those. So I do think that compliance with the NDC may be discussed in environmental impact assessments, but that's just a disclosure matter. And overall, it's really US politics rather than either legislation or litigation that I think is going to determine whether the US fulfills its new ambitious NDC.
Thank you, Michael. Fascinating and really, well, challenging legal and policy environment in the US. And we will be for sure all watching with a lot of interest how that unfolds. But let's go to the panel discussion. There are quite a few questions popping up in the chat. Please continue to ask your questions and introduce yourself as you do so. I should mention that we're planning to have, it's not a one-off conversation today. We're actually planning to have, in addition to discussion tomorrow on climate litigation, we're planning to have an event in parallel to COP26 to pick up on the issues that will be raised today. So we're going to produce a briefing based on the discussion, and some of the questions that we can't address today, we will pick up then at the COP. But let me start. You can see that quite a few participants have been asking about the UK's case, and in particular some challenges the UK is facing in terms of its fourth and fifth carbon budget, and also some shortcomings highlighted by the Committee on Climate Change on policies planned to implement the sixth carbon budget. So I think quite a few colleagues, James Hewitt and a few others, have been wondering what are the mechanisms for actually ensuring that the carbon budgets can be met. And then there is also a broader question that there is still, the UK's example shows that there is the issue of time inconsistency in policy making, and it still has been fully addressed. So it reminds the person asking the question of fiscal frameworks, which are often enshrined in law, but are then ignored when the situation changes. So what panelists think are the credible ways to solve this time inconsistency issue, and to ensure that the long-term dimension of policy spans more than one parliamentary term? So that's a question from Frank H. So I'll go first to Claire, and then any other panelist who wants to comment on this question, please feel free to jump in. Claire.
Thank you. Well, excellent questions. So first of all, in terms of the UK, and are we on or off track to meet carbon budgets 4 and 5? And what do we think about the latest response from the CCC? of course, the obvious point is the very fact that we're having these discussions about carbon budgets and what an independent expert groups is probably a strength of the testimony of the actual framework that it exposes these issues and we're talking about them. The UK does recognise that more needs to be done to meet carbon budgets 4 and 5, but we're not in breach. These are forward-looking future carbon budgets, and all the ones we've had to date, we've exceeded. So we've not reached that very interesting point on which panellists might also have views about what happens if and how would courts in a variety of jurisdictions react to a position to actually give teeth to carbon budgets. The commentator asking about fiscal laws raises a good question about remedies. We're certainly seeing across, not only in the domestic courts in the UK, but across European courts and more generally, I think, an uptick in climate litigation, not only against state actors, but non-state actors as well, and how that feeds through, and that in turn drives future policy making, as we're seeing in the German example. The UK hasn't yet published how it's going to meet its carbon budget 6. That is coming ahead of COP26 in part of its net zero strategy. But there have been some publications along the way, like the 10-point plan and the PM's commitment to double spending on international climate finance. But I wonder if it might be worth hearing from other panellists about the role of the courts, because as someone passionate about the rule of law, I think that's quite important to hear how we think courts are equipped to deal with these types of challenges, particularly where we're dealing with scientific evidence and perhaps competing views on how quick the pace of change should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Would anyone else like to comment on this question?
Well, I'll just say a word about the role of the courts. I think, as has been noted, there are some very notable decisions from the Netherlands, Germany, just now, France, Australia, Colombia, in a number of countries that are Nepal, Pakistan. We're seeing lots of decisions around the world that are really giving teeth to some of these requirements and are finding that human rights doctrines and constitutional rights doctrines are real and enforceable and apply to climate change. We're not seeing that so much in the US, but in many other countries, the courts are really playing a very important role. And scientific disputes have not been central to these cases. The courts have pretty much accepted the IPCC and other authoritative bodies, and the disputes are mostly the legal disputes about the role of the courts. And as I said, in a number of countries, the courts are finding that they really do have significant power here.
Thank you, Michael. Michel?
Yeah, I mean, also on the question of the implementation, just again, I think, I mean, on the European level, now we have it into law, and if we are then able with this implementation legislation that's coming up to make it real, I think then it's also pretty safe. So it's we have this emission trading scheme with a cap and trade system. So basically you define the amount of CO2 budget that you still have in the system, make it certificates and let people who want to emit trade it. So you establish also a carbon price with it. It has a lot of shortcomings, the current system, but at least, I mean, you cannot, well, hopefully, if there are not low forces inside, you cannot emit more than is inside the system. So that's maybe the positive thing of it. The other thing is that when we see currently a lot of EU car manufacturers investing most of their capital into the development of e-cars, and that's also because we have a very strict CO2 standard rules. So car makers are required to reduce the amount new cars and their fleet is emitting in terms of CO2. So that's not an overall cap. That's problematic. The more cars you have, you also have more CO2 emissions. But still, if car manufacturers do not meet these requirements, they have to pay a lot of fines, and that actually makes them currently invest a lot into e-cars. And you see, actually, if you follow the Euro Championships, that also they want to sell their cars. VW only makes now advertisement for their e-cars, and I think that brings a new interesting development into it. And also, if member states in the effort chain regulation are not able to meet their reduction targets, they have to pay fines or basically ask other member states for getting their emission rights, and that's quite costly. So there is some ways of making sure that it will be actually implemented. Now, I think if you look, it's really interesting if you look into the court ruling of the German court case. I think they also translated it into English, because they actually discuss a lot about science there, and they even the notion on which they base this intertemporal freedom rights is the carbon budget, and the carbon budget derived from a scientific report of the German scientific advisory body for sustainable development. So that's quite interesting. I think that here you have really the Constitutional Court really trying to understand the science and apply it. And yeah, I don't even think that there's a lot of scientific disputes happening on these questions. So now the science is actually quite clear. So now it's just the courts that are now actually taking or looking at them and implementing in it. That's a really interesting and good development.
Thank you. We have a question to Amy, primarily, I think, by Sohituddin from Lloyd's of London. So here is asking, can you please expand a bit more on the finance package for COP26, in particular, how emphasis on this, namely private finance sector, will be maintained in the post-2020 agenda?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I certainly can do. Claire might want to come in on this as well, because a lot of it's under Mark Carney's initiative. And so maybe there's space there. I mean, one of the big pieces of the COP package is obviously the finance, but of course there's private sector finance and there's public sector finance. And so you'll probably be aware of some of those elements. Some, you know, there's the Mark Carney initiative as part of COP26 looks at things like mandatory reporting, credibility of companies' claims around net zero, things like the central bank, the remit of central banks to demand stress tests. And some of you will know about the scaled up voluntary carbon market initiatives that look at bringing, you know, 300 million into the voluntary carbon market space. So I think that those are a very short summary of some of the areas we expect to see in that sort of private sector debate around the finance package. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, Claire, would you like to add anything to this?
I think I would just probably confine myself saying yes, the Mark Carney initiative is something that obviously is a key thing for the presidency. Alongside the reflections that Amy had, there's obviously something particularly when we're looking at mobilizing private finance about how wide we go. So things like the green taxonomy and how we actually green things across the piece and kind of broaden out climate change from being something of kind of focusing just on kind of state actors, but to the whole of the economy, and how we have almost like the parallel with food labeling and how we are using labels correctly so that as consumers we can make informed choices in our kind of our home lives as well. Thank you.
So we have quite a few questions on the United States, understandably. Michael, there is a question from Michal Nachmani from Climate Policy Radar. She's asking how much of the federal level action will make a direct impact and how much will be needed to be followed by state action to generate actual reduction in emissions. And similar question for adaptation legislation, kind of the relationship between state level and national level initiatives. And so here a related question is asking, what is the role of the US financial sector and firms to potentially help circumnavigate the political gridlock in Washington? Thank you.
Sure. Well, the states are very important, and you have different laws that apply at different levels. The motor vehicle emission standards are federal, but the vehicle miles traveled are set by land use standards, which are state and local. Electricity generation is mostly regulated at the state level, but a federal clean energy standard would put that at the would have the federal government controlling that. The EPA under President Obama tried to impose greenhouse gas emissions controls on the power sector, but that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. So the states play a central role, and many states have adopted strong climate change legislation. Most recently, the state of Oregon just about 4 days ago. And even some of the states that are Democratic can have influence on what's happening in the Republican states through the requirement of the purchase of clean electricity. And a lot of the electricity comes from other states, but the states certainly do play a very important role. And the states that oppose climate legislation, like Texas and West Virginia, are pushing back. With respect to adaptation, there's really no federal law comprehensively on adaptation. There are flood insurance standards and so forth, but adaptation, to the extent it happens, is mostly at the state and municipal level. And there are actually few states that have comprehensive adaptation laws. That's really mostly at the city level. With respect to the role of the financial sector, so sort of BlackRock and some other major investors have come out with strong statements on climate change, which I think are influencing corporate behavior, or at least corporate disclosures. But those financial institutions are not using their political clout in Washington. And they're not spending money on campaign contributions that try to influence what Congress does. They're not putting heavy lobbying work into that. The financial institutions have other things they want from Washington, and they're not focusing on climate change. So I think that the financial institutions are playing a significant role on the corporate side, but they're not yet having much impact on the political side.
Thank you, Michael. We have an interesting question on the importance of just transition. So I'm really posing it to the whole panel for whoever wants to come in. Kirsty Fernhast is asking that the majority of climate change legislation is based on reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. However, getting there must be just transition. How might the legal framework ensure just transition principles? That's the first question. And is there a place for this international law, for the international law beyond the preamble of the Paris Agreement? So who would like to tackle this one?
Well, I'll just say that in the US, just transition is a very important part of President Biden's policies. He's put environmental justice very high on his list of priorities, together with climate change and COVID recovery and some other things. And so there's a great deal of attention being paid by the Biden administration to make sure that the people who are displaced from work in the fossil fuel sector and so forth are retrained or given other jobs, and their pensions are taken care of and so forth. So that's an important part of US policy.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else, Michel?
Yeah, maybe I can say the same. Also from the European level, we have a Just Transition Fund. Part of this big investment, or this big fund to get out of the COVID crisis. I mean, it has to be spent on developing. 37% has to be spent on climate action, but that of course also means transitioning and investing into new technologies that then can actually provide the workspaces for the people that lost their jobs. I think another interesting question is who pays for the transition. We are discussing this now. We will discuss it soon in the European side when we discuss about the new ETS for the transport and the building sector. So a new emission trading scheme with a lot of resistance from countries, for instance, like France, where they said if we increase fuel prices, we will see something like yellow vest movements again. So an ETS, so a CO2 price in the transport sector should not be the way to go. but then, for instance, we Greens, we say, okay, that's correct. Actually, we are happy with a high CO2 price, but it has to be redistributed back. We have this idea of Energiegeld, so direct payments to households, that all of the revenues from charging transport emissions should be directly redistributed back to households. Or, and this is the other side, just go with the standards, because in standardization, it's not the consumers who then pay the price and have the burden to change their behavior, but then it's the industry who has to change their investment strategy.
Thank you. Mr. William, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the transition issue is very important, because you are talking about the public-private sector partnership. So I believe that the enforcement should take into consideration the transition timeline. For example, now, I mean, globally, we are being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So how far can we really apply the laws in terms of, I mean, really dealing with the carbon emission? So I believe that this has to be taken into consideration, but the laws are there to stay, but now there should be a transition period. Thank you.
Thank you. And Amy, you had some thoughts on how just transition plays out at the international level.
Yeah, just transition isn't just a question of the preamble of the Paris Agreement. It's an integral part of the work of the Katowice Committee of Experts on the Impacts and of the Implementation of Response Measures, which is, and actually last week they put out a call for submissions on concrete examples and best practices on just transition issues. So it's a key part of the discussion under the UNFCCC as to how you ensure that fair transition. So I think it's important to understand it's has its place also at the UNFCCC as a discussion between countries of best practice and experience sharing. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions on the role of climate laws in actually affecting directly either regulating or stimulating corporate behavior. So Louise Fournier is wondering, are there any laws that directly impose greenhouse gas emission reductions on corporate actors? Do we see any trends in terms of increase of such laws and in such laws? And then Rudy Lee is asking a related question about spillover effects of climate governance and interconnected issue areas, and wondering what instruments in climate legislation could help guide policies and incentivize national and local level to promote green investments by companies. So anyone has any thoughts to share on that? Michael.
Well, I'll say in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency has used the Clean Air Act to impose requirements on corporate emissions. One of those, as I said, was struck down by the Supreme Court, but there are a number of others that apply. Clearly, the motor vehicle emission standards directly affect the emissions from motor vehicles. There are other regulations on methane emissions from corporations and so forth. So we do have a number of direct controls, and many states are imposing direct emission controls on corporations.
Thank you, Claire.
I was going to say something along similar lines, that while we might have a very kind of regulatory law framework in the UK Climate Change Act, we're obviously seeing actors at all levels, from parish councils to our devolved and national assemblies, declaring climate emergencies. And we're seeing obviously an uptick in how that is actually embedded in day-to-day work, regulatory practice, administrative practices and policies. It is interesting, I think, to always to see at what point things translate from soft law or kind of ambitious aims into things which actually take effect in hard law as well. I think that's something which we're quite interested to see how that develops, and how particularly non-state actors can respond to that, particularly noting in different jurisdictions there might not be an ability to build bipartisan processes whereby you can take everything at the state level. And the other point I would say is, while some very big things can be done, a lot of the UK's reductions have been on the energy side, where I spend half the other time of my week on renewable energy and things like that. A lot of it is in the latter half of this first half of the century is going to come down to consumer behaviour and individual things, which involves a far wider regulatory numbers of frameworks rather than purely, electricity systems and changing what colour our electrons are that we receive. Thank you.
Thank you. There is, I think there are a couple of questions on the role of science, both in climate legislation, but also in litigation in terms of scientific attribution. So really an open question to anyone who would like to comment. How do you see the role of scientific expertise in developing and implementing climate laws and also in enabling court action? So who would like to take this one?
Yeah, just, for us, on developing the European climate law, it was really important to bring that aspect into the law, because in the first draft from the Commission it wasn't there. And we actually also, with the help of Alina and others, we saw that in the climate laws in European member states that have this scientific expertise advice, they are the ones actually that function well. And there you can see like a correlation between well-working climate laws and scientific advice. So that therefore it was really important for us to bring that in, and I believe that it's because, as it was said before, like there's this legislators of 4 or 5 years, and there's like changing majorities, but the science is not changing, and we need to have something that we all can like agree on and work with, and that makes it much more easier to actually say like, no, it's like this or it's like that. And then we can work from this and do not have to debate everything from scratch again. And we really hope to then have advice that is critical and that tells us, look, this is where you actually meet your targets, and this is where you are going off-road, or believing that you can build up, I don't know, a lot of your forests, whereas the actual science tells us that the climate crisis is already going in this direction, that we are losing our things, then we would have to possibly think about something else. So I think it will be really an important body, this European scientific advice body. And yeah, the first thing is then, interestingly, the question of the CO2 budget, and I think on the international level it has not been solved. So the IPCC is establishing global CO2 budgets with likelihoods, what we have to what we can still emit in order to avoid 2 degrees or 1.5 or get to 1.5 degree. But then it's not divided amongst parties, and that's a problem, because who takes which responsibility? We have to discuss this somehow, because in the end, this CO2 budget is finite. No, we cannot just emit more, but then we will just increase temperature. So they will come up with I hope with some ideas. I think one is that, first of all, we have to be truthful to ourselves. We will not be able to live with a CO2 budget that would be fairly based on fair distribution amongst all states. So that also, but then it also means that if we truly admit that, okay, we want to have more of the CO2 budget, we need to do more for international cooperation, and we need to do more in other states, that they will be able to mitigate faster. And I hope that we can see some kind of development from really listening to the science, and then have science-based debates to really then come to results which are honest. And that means we have to reduce fast, but we also have to support the others to reduce fast.
Thank you.
I'll just add, I mean, of course, science is central to both legislation and litigation. And on the legislative and regulatory side, some emerging scientific understandings, I think, are changing some of the emphasis. So in recent years, we've come to a greater understanding of the important role of methane in worsening climate change. So I think we're seeing more legislative and regulatory attention to methane. On the litigation side, of course, the scientific findings are central to the litigation, but the scientific findings tend not to be in dispute. There has never been a court decision in the world, so far as I know, where the court has cast doubt on climate science. They accept the findings, and many climate lawsuits have been dismissed, but not because the science was not adequately presented. They tend to be dismissed on legal grounds, jurisdictional or standing or separation of powers. It's not a shortcoming in the science or the use of science that is leading to the dismissal of some of the climate lawsuits that have been dismissed.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our debate, and there are still many questions we couldn't answer today. But before we close, I was just wondering if each of the panelists could take a few seconds to reflect based on the discussions today and also based on your experience on working in this area. What do you see as the priority issues in terms of research and focus on climate legislation going forward? Any concluding thoughts you might have on the importance of the subject for COP26 discussions? So who'd like to go first? Just a few words. Claire, would start with you.
I'm afraid my connection might be slightly off. I'm sorry. So I didn't fully catch the question, but I think what we are looking forward to is obviously a successful COP, a successful high ambitious COP. Clearly part of what makes a COP successful is not what happens only in the room, but the legacy of it and how we can use good regulatory structures at very different levels, from the supranational to the supra-regional, to deliver that. So that, I think, is somewhere where it is very interesting to see how the court's jurisprudence develops and how we see the interrelationship between policy development, courts reflecting the policy development, and that feeding back into policies later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Clara. That's a really great summary, I think, of the different aspects we discussed today. I think we have about 1 minute left. Anyone else would like to share their thoughts in conclusion?
I think I could just quickly say a lot of what we see from the UNFCCC side is the importance of capacity building and sharing expertise. And, you know, we work as a small part of a bigger group working on the toolkits, on model laws, but the need for capacity building cuts across every question of implementation of anything that is agreed at the international level. And so the success of any implementation is also how much help any given country needs in order to bring something into play. Many that they are very willing to do, but there just isn't the resource to enable it. So I think that's really crucial in delivering the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. William, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. I feel that COP26, there should be more political will, because, I mean, political will is very important for commitment. And I also support the points raised by Amy, that capacity building as well is very, very, very important for us to do, I mean, for COP26. I thank you.
Thank you. Michael, Michel, and any of you wanted to come in? Right.
Well, we need a very, very rapid transition in the electricity sector away from fossil fuels toward renewables, and we need a massive growth of the electricity sector so that we can electrify transport and buildings and so forth. So it'll be very useful to see those countries that succeed in affecting this, you know, the massive build out of wind and solar and other renewables that we need, and that could present good examples for the rest of the world on how to achieve that very important objective.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Okay.
I think it would be really interesting to have maybe another round and then discuss with colleagues from the US if this race to zero is really happening. So there's this idea that now the investments in the transformation are actually taking place because companies believe that these are the future global markets, the carbon neutral markets with carbon neutral products. And that would be really good because I think it would change the whole dynamic of everything. And then secondly, I think what I believe is very interesting also maybe to research on is this question of is there really a new kind of human right in the making, this right to a healthy climate? And as we see kind of, human rights are being developed with time. And I think there's a young generation that, at least in Europe, was very strong in asking for their right to a healthy future. Now the German court has somehow confirmed that. So will we see, I mean, I hope, and I will fight for this, but to have something like a human right to a healthy environment and a healthy climate in hopefully 20 years time or 30.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of the speakers today and to the audience for really insightful and lively discussion. I hope you will join us tomorrow to continue debate on the role of climate litigation, and we're looking forward to seeing you again also at the COP events we're going to be hosting on climate legislation and litigation. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you.